That's page 855. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching.
Why aren't you listening? All right, let's try that again. So as I mentioned last week, we spoke about the fig tree or the fruitless fig tree and the way Jesus looked at it and the hypocrisy that this tree was, brought about. And this morning we're going to look at the temple. Still not there? Is it there? I shouldn't even be listening to my wife. She never listens to me anyway, right? So, anyway, let's try it one more time, guys. And so this morning we're going to look at Jesus and the account at the temple. And we often, at least I hope this is how what is in our minds, is that I hope that we always are asking Jesus to show up, especially on a Sunday morning. Because if he doesn't show up, then everything that you and I are doing this morning is really in vain, right? And we see that Jesus shows up at the temple, but he's not coming to show up at the temple to bless these people, but he's there to come and bring some serious condemnation and judgment upon them, right? And so we're going to look at that this morning. We're going to look at a couple of aspects, and I hope that God will bless you this morning as we explore the text in Mark chapter 11. So let's go there this morning. And let's read verse 11, because what we're going to see as we look at it this morning is that Jesus came. Use this one rather. So what we're going to see is that as Jesus comes and looks at the temple, if we read in verse 11, it says, Jesus entered Jerusalem, came into the temple, and after looking around at everything, he left for Bethany with the 12, since it was already late. Whatever Jesus saw there that Sunday, he was going to address on the Monday when he came back into Jerusalem. And so let's look at the background this morning. No? All right. Is that it? All right, let's just leave it. Let's look at the background this morning. And is it working, Ivan? I'm not sure what's going on there. But what we see is that Jesus is observing the temple, right? And as he looks at the temple, there's things that he's looking at clearly that he's not okay with. And whatever it is that he sees, he's about to address. And we see that he does it quite harshly, right? And so what I need us to understand this morning as we consider this text and as we look at the temple, that Jesus takes the temple, or his temple, very seriously, and the things that are going on within the temple. And we know that our bodies are the temple of the Lord. But for those of you who don't know, this is actually the second time that Jesus cleanses the temple. Did you know that? Trish, did you know that? Remember, the first time that he cleanses the temple is at the beginning of his ministry in John chapter 2, right just after the wedding at Cana. And this is towards the end of his ministry, right, where he cleans the temple. For those of you who are unsure and maybe not sure about what I'm talking about and maybe saying, man, where did you guys get this from? I want you to go with me to the book of Leviticus chapter 14 this morning. I want you to look at a principle there, I guess, that we're going to relate to why we're saying that this is the second time that he cleanses the temple. So go with me to the book of Leviticus chapter 14 this morning. And let's look at what the text has to say there. And so we're going to be reading from verses 33 through 45 this morning in the book of Leviticus chapter 14. And I want you to listen to what this law was that was given to the people. So verse 33 of the book of Leviticus 14 says, "The Lord further spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, When you enter the land of Canaan, which I give you for possession, and I put a mark of leprosy on a house in the land of your possession, then the one who owns the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, Something like a mark of leprosy has become visible to me in the house. The priest shall then command that they empty the house before the priest goes in to look at the mark, so that everything in the house need not become unclean. And after the priest shall go in to look at the house, so he shall look at the mark, and if the mark on the walls of the house has greenish or reddish depressions and appears deeper than the surface, then the priest shall come out of the house to the doorway and quarantine the house for 7 days. The priest shall return on the 7th day and make an inspection. If the mark has indeed spread in the walls of the house, then the priest shall order them to tear out the stones with the mark in them and throw them away at an unclean place outside the city. He shall have the house scraped all around inside, and they shall dump the plaster that they scraped off at an unclean place outside the city. Then they shall take other stones and replace those stones, and he shall take the other plaster, replaster the house. And if however the mark breaks out again in the house after he has torn out the stones and scraped the house, and after it has been replastered, then the priest shall come in and make an inspection. If he sees that the mark has indeed spread in the house, it is a malignant mark in the house, and it is unclean. He shall therefore, verse 45, tear down the house, its stones and its timbers, and all the plaster of the house, and he shall take them outside the city to an unclean place. Using this principle this morning, or at least this law, it's clear to see that Jesus had to destroy the temple. Do you remember that he tells his disciples that what? He's going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Remember that? And so it's important for us to know about this, because if he cleaned it the first time, and he's coming here towards the end of his ministry, and he's got to clean it again, according to this text, the whole house has to be pulled down, right? Hence the reason that Jesus needed to destroy the temple and rebuild it. Does that make sense this morning? And I think it's a very important point for us to note, that when things cannot be repaired, that God is going to break it down and he's going to rebuild it. And that may even be with regard to our lives at times. And that may not always be comfortable, but it's what is needed in order for his house to be presented as holy. And so let's look this morning at the temple courts. And so our next slide, our lesson takes place in the court of the Gentiles. And what we have, Ivan, is there a slide there with the temple court? Can you bring that one up to me? So what we have over there, we'll see that there's the court of the Gentiles. You have women's court. You have the court of Israel. And then you have the court of the priests. Now the court of the Gentiles was basically where Gentiles would come and kind of pray to God. And then we had the women's court where women could enter into, but men of Israel could also go there. And then we had the court of Israel, which was basically only the men of Israel could go and pray there. And then beyond that, as you see, we have the holy place where the priests were only able to go into, and obviously the Holy of Holies. And so this is kind of the layout of the temple. And this morning, our lesson takes place in the court of the Gentiles. And so let's go back to the book of Mark 15 this morning. Sorry, Mark 11. And let's read from verse 15. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were buying, selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and seats of those who were selling doves. Now, what we need to understand here this morning is that part of Jewish worship involved sacrifice of animals. And so what we can see here, if we think about it, we think about, why is Jesus being so unfair, right? These guys are just providing a really good service, right, for the people of God. They're making it so convenient for them because these guys have to travel from all over the world to Jerusalem, right, to come and worship God. So why is Jesus going on like this? Why is it that he's throwing these the animals, sending them out? Why is he overturning tables? Like, what's up with him? These guys are providing a good service. And I want you to just hold that thought for just a minute this morning. We know that Mark also mentions that they were selling doves. Doves were being sold. And this was the offering of the poor, right? And so we see that from the wealthy to the poor, that they were providing everything. So making it very convenient. But I guess this morning that's exactly what the problem was, isn't it? Is that their worship was being made convenient. And sometimes that's how it is in our life today, is that we want worship of convenience, right? We don't want our worship we don't want our lives to be turned upside down. We want God to fit into our lives, right? And yet it's got to be the other way around, where our lives fit into what God wants. Amen? And this is what they were doing here. Now I want you to note a couple of things this morning as well. That obviously we know that they had to give a temple tax, and this was instituted again in the book of Nehemiah when they rebuilt the walls and they set everything up in the way that it should have been. They instituted the shekel of the sanctuary, but it was a third of a shekel. And so what we need to know here when it talks about a shekel, that these individuals were charging interest on the portion that was supposed to be given to God, right? And so if we think of all of this, there's some crazy things going on here as well, because one of the other things that we need to know is that this had to be paid in Jewish currency, right? Not Roman currency. And so it's clear for us to understand why the money changers needed to be there. But in them being there, we know that they also charged a fee, which is no different to our banks today, right? So what we need to understand is that God is not happy about what's going on with the temple. And I hope as we paint this picture this morning, that it will be clear for us to see what's really going on here and why Jesus is so upset about this. And so let's go to the text and let's look at a couple of things here this morning regarding the temple. Let's look at a couple of phrases, I guess. He talks about the idea of the vessels that are being dragged through the temple, right? Vessels that are going through the temple. So what they were using is they were using the temple as a trade route, right? From the eastern gate, sort of from the Mount of Olives all the way through to Jerusalem. It was a shortcut into the city. And they were using the temple as a shortcut. And we know that the Mishnah, which is the Jewish oral law, clearly states that this was not allowed. And I want to read you just a little excerpt out of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is the Jewish law, oral law, and basically what it does is it takes the laws, the Torah, so to speak, and what it does, it kind of expands on that, so explains what those laws mean. Makes sense? And so I want you to read, I want to read a portion out of it. And I want you to just build a context to this, because I'm just going to read you a portion of this, but the portion prior to this, it's Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5, right? Which speak about how we must love God with all that we are, right? And then it goes into this next part where it says, one should not show disrespect to the eastern gate, because it is in a direct line with the Holy of Holies. One should not enter the Temple Mount with a staff, or with shoes on, or with a wallet, or with dusty feet, nor should one make it a shortcut, as it is forbidden. Right? So that's just a small part. It goes on, it's interesting, some of the other things that are mentioned there. But it's clear for us to see this morning that what was going on at the temple was really forbidden. And the Jews knew this, and yet they were still doing this. But the biggest issue, I believe, for Jesus is that what they were doing is they were hindering the worship of the Gentiles to God. Remember we looked at the temple courts earlier? And we saw the court of the Gentiles, which was set aside for the Gentiles to come and pray and kind of worship God, right? And what was going on is this marketplace was in their court. So this was an utter disregard for the Gentiles. And they were hindering them from really being able to worship God. And I wonder in our lives today, with all the things that are going on and our distractions, if we are not hindering individuals from being able to worship, serve God. Perhaps we, in the way we live our lives at times, are hindering the world from finding Christ because we are so distracted. And perhaps maybe we are no different to these individuals in the story that we're reading about this morning. You're still with me? And I think what Jesus is saying here this morning is that we really need to be mindful of what He wants and not what we want. They knew exactly what the law stated, and yet they still. Sometimes I think we know exactly what the Bible says, and yet in order to justify a lifestyle, we'll ignore what God says. Let's go back to the text because I want to paint another picture for you this morning. I want you to note some of the phrases used here, because what I want you to see that this is not a pretty picture, okay, that Jesus or that the Bible paints for us. Notice some of these phrases here. It says, verse 15 and 16, it says, drive out. Do you see that? He began to drive out. Now, I don't know if you know, but if you've ever watched cattle being driven, how do they do it? Do they do it kind of like... Not how it's done. We've seen pictures before, right? Some come out with a whip, right? They track that whip and these guys start moving. To understand that as Jesus drives them out, He's not saying, Dan, don't you the next phrase he says, overturn. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm sure you've seen tables overturned. Like if you've watched movies, maybe at a poker game or something. It's something that I often want to do when I lose. Which is not often, by the way, but when I do. But have you seen it? Like if you flip the table, what would happen? Like things would go flying. Right? Is it a pretty sight? And also when it's done, it's not done with a smile on your face, right? So I want you to understand this. And in the last phrase, I want you to see here this morning. In verse 15 and 16 it says, He would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. Now I don't know about you, but if you're trying to stop somebody from coming, say, through the door, what's that going to look like? You really don't want them to where they want to come in. What's that going to look like this morning, sir? And you're like, no, you can't come in here. And the guy's going to go, really? You little guy trying to stop me? What's it going to look like? You're going to be pushing, right? You're maybe going to be shoving. You're going to be wrestling with that individual because you want to keep them out. So understand that what's going on here is not pretty. And the Jesus and the God that we see that walked on this earth, we always see Him as a meek individual, as a humble individual, right? Which He was. But when it comes to the things of God, there's a flip, there's a change. Church, there's a change. Because He's about His Father's business. And He takes the house and the things of God very seriously. And that's why the text goes on to say, and not in this specific account, but it talks about how zeal has consumed Him. I want you to drop down to verse 17. It says, And He began to teach and say to them, Is it not written, My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations? So the next phrase is there, my house. Notice that he says, my house. You see that? This is the Son of God, but he's equating himself to God now by saying, my house. And we all know that he's quoting scripture. But he says, my house. Then he says, house of prayer. And what was happening over here, that these guys were not allowing for an environment for these Gentiles to be able to offer up prayer to God. And then he equates the church or the temple to a house of robbers or a robber's den. And the idea behind this in the first century was that it could be twofold. It could either be the idea that robbers hide in a cave, right? And they wait for their prey, or they just hide. And the second idea is obviously that they're preying on people, watching, waiting to pounce and take their belongings. And it's no different today when we look at our churches and all these different movements throughout the world today, right? A lot of churches are all about money and making money, and they're pushing numbers, etc., right? But that's not what I want to focus on so much this morning. I want to focus on the first explanation, and that is they hide. And have we hidden ourselves so much that the world cannot find us? That the world cannot find, they cannot see the very house of God, because we have hidden ourselves from it. Maybe through the distractions that come our way, maybe through the challenges that we have allowed to take precedence in our life. I don't know. But have we hidden ourselves from being the very light of God in us to be, so that men may see and find the very house of God? The last thing this morning, with regard to our text in verse 18, it says the chief priests and scribes heard this. It said they began to seek out to destroy him. It says that they were afraid of him. It says that the crowd was astonished. Now, we can do two things this morning. We can either take this word that we've heard and that we continuously look at, and we can ignore it, which is really the same thing as trying to destroy the church, the temple of God, for Jesus. You hear that? Well, why do I say that? Simply because of this. If we ignore this word, how does it change us? And if it doesn't change us, how can we make the change in the world? It's just as good as Jesus being stuck in the tomb and never being risen. Right? It says they were afraid of him, which means he came across the power and authority. And it's the same God that we serve today that gives us that same power and same authority to restore. But here's the thing. It says that the crowd was astonished. Now why were they astonished? Because they were hearing the very word of God, spoken from an individual with zeal, power and authority. And perhaps it was something that they'd never heard before. Maybe they were reminded of it. I don't know. But it's strange that the very people of God were astonished by the word that was given to them. That they were entrusted by it. The word of God. And today you and I have the word of God. And I hope that as we read through it, that it will permeate our lives and change us. Maybe that we'll have those wow moments. Hopefully it will lead us to change. And so the next slide, think about hopefully gives an idea of focus. Can you read any of the other words that are there? Sure. And can you read anything else there? Besides the for and the ver and the honor or something? Can you read any of the ones on the outside? Why is that? Because it's not important. But what is important 5-letter name that we call Jesus. And that's where our focus needs to be. My focus needs to be on Jesus. Nothing else, no one else. And I hope that we are not like these individuals that are so focused on everything else except the Jesus that we serve. Amen? Because it's so easy to get distracted by these minor, little, frivolous things that hinder our worship. Make sense? And I want to challenge you this morning to really relook at where your heart, where your mind is, where your focus is. God's will. When you come through those doors, it's about Jesus. Amen? Church? It's about Him. And it's going to continuously be about Him. So the easier or the sooner we understand that, the more simpler and more powerful our worship is going to be. And so our final slide. Ask 3 questions. And that is, have we fallen short? Have we lost focus? Have we become distracted? And I can only answer these for myself this morning, as it will be personal for each and every one of us. But I hope that we have not answered yes. If you had, then my challenge to you this morning, make the change. You make the change. And see the difference. Amen? Because if Jesus shows up here, I hope He comes to bless, not you, or your work, but the kingdom. May we never be found wanting, and may our eyes always seven things. Amen. May God bless you as you go this week. May you be mindful of Him. And may you continue to walk courageously. For He is God. He loves you. Amen. Stand and sing.